All right, I am here with three wonderful friends. Katherine Leary Alsdorf, former Executive Director, City to City Global Faith and Work Initiative. Andy Crouch, Partner for Theology and Culture for Praxis. And my own pastor and our co-host today, Pastor Jackson Crum of Park Community Church. Welcome, everyone.
Good to be here, Tony.
Hey, Ian, before we start and dig in, Katherine and Andy, I'd love to hear from you. How has life been for you guys? I know, Katherine, some things have happened to you, but can you both each provide a little update on how things are going for you during this time?
Show you my broken arm. Actually, it's been an interesting time for me. I was headed into a sabbatical the beginning of April, hopefully a 2-month sabbatical. Although having a hard time saying no to things, I had about 6 speaking trips traveled during that or scheduled during that sabbatical time. So those have all been canceled, and I've been able to have more. I've been able to have the sabbatical God wanted me to have.
Wow.
So I was really transitioning out of a role and using this time to see where God was leading me at this later stage of my life and career, actually leading me and my husband. So we're still in that process of discernment.
Andy?
I would say three things have all been happening together since COVID-19 hit the United States and our part of the United States. The first is some really beautiful gifts. It's springtime here in the northeastern U.S. and just being able to be outside. And we live in a lovely part of the world, and I've enjoyed it more than ever this year. My daughter came home very abruptly from university, and I miss her like crazy when she's away. So having my daughter back in our home has been beautiful. So there's been many things like that have been great and just genuinely sources of joy and comfort. Also a huge sense of lament and loss. The work that I love to do, most of the work that I have loved to do, I cannot do. I do a lot of speaking. I'm in a lot of places where people are singing. I'm in a lot of places where people gather together. None of those things can happen right now. And the more of the lament is how long it will be before those things can happen again. I would judge years probably. So just the sense of just losing so much that I felt made my life worthwhile and joyful and rewarding has been really hard. And then I would say the third thing has been really surprising new things to do. I haven't been on sabbatical. That definitely isn't what it's felt like. We've been able to write some articles at Praxis and offer some resources that have made a difference for people. And the demand to follow up on that has been way more than we expected and pretty meaningful. So all of these things at once have been happening.
Got it. Jackson?
Hey, Katherine, you're in the middle of a transition, going from city to city, leaving city to city, and transitioning to Missy. How's that going?
It's going really well, although very different than planned. We spent about 9 months looking for the right person to take that role, and Missy couldn't be the more. You couldn't
Amazing.
find a more perfect person.
Yeah.
And we hired her to build global faith and work initiative. The vision is that we're planting churches in cities all over the world, and rather than have a equipping of the people of the church to work in the world as an add-on, a class in their discipleship, the idea here is we get that instituted in churches from the very beginning, from their first day opening their doors. And so it was a build role, but given what's gone on, our work at City to City, like Andy was describing, is heavily travel oriented. We catalyze, we train, we coach, we mentor. And so she is fortunately also the right person to do a strategic pivot. She's involved not just in the faith and work part, but she's on the team at City to City that's helping them think through everything about the work they do and what needs in anticipation of both probably lower donor support and ongoing restrictions on travel for some foreseeable future, there's really some dramatic pivots that are needing to go on there. So I think it's going well. We've got the best person you could have. I'm helping teach and give my 2 cents wherever I can, but she's a great leader.
I've heard nothing but good things about your work. What's next for you since you're handing this off? What's God have for you?
Yeah, I don't know yet because I'm still trying to give myself time to do that. I'm teaching and writing, and I think I'd like to be a little more local. I've been in 30 plus years, I've had very global roles. And so I would like to drill down both in individual groups' lives. I love working with cohorts over 9 months' time and really getting to know them, as well as seeing city impact at a very specific local level rather than I want to not just do the talk, but walk the walk. So,
thank you, Andy. For those that maybe don't know exactly what Praxis is, would you share a little bit about what that does?
Yes, Praxis is a community of entrepreneurs and people who are in what you might call the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So investors and mentors, both for-profit and nonprofit. So we are very agnostic or unconcerned with how you structure your work. We believe there's redemptive ways to build for-profit businesses and nonprofit organizations. And we're trying to advance what we call redemptive entrepreneurship. So a kind of building of ventures in the world that have the potential to really scale. So sometimes entrepreneurship just means small business, and small business is very important. But we're especially interested in the kinds of businesses and organizations that can grow, but that can do that in a redemptive way and not in an exploitative way, and that do that with a deep kind of underpinning in the gospel, rather than just the other sources of entrepreneurship. So it's an amazing community that I get to serve alongside and all over the world, most of all in the US, but quite global in its distribution.
No, that sounds incredibly exciting. Katherine, let me go back to you. The book that you're a part of, Every Good Endeavor, fantastic book, came out 8 years ago. If you're writing it today, in the middle of this pandemic, what would you add? What would you highlight?
Well, Tim and I had already talked about the parts of it that we wanted to improve, and had thought in 2022, that'd be the 10 years. Maybe that's a good time for an addition with some things. And we wanted to go more into the kingdom of God and trying to really look at the scriptural resources for that. I think the third part of it could be the book is divided into 3 parts. The third part of it could be expanded into parts 4, 5, and 6, probably. So we had tons of ideas before this. Because of the pandemic, I still think it's foundational. I mean, when we wrote it, we tried to say this needs to be theology that works for people in rural Africa or people in New York City, and God's word and the theology that grows out of it is universal. But I think I'd like to focus on fruits of the Spirit more based on the pandemic. I think areas like perseverance and patience, virtues that grow out of our relationship with Christ are, maybe I'm speaking largely for myself. I feel the lack of that and would really like to grow more. And so you're right about things that you need.
That is so true. I look forward to that rewrite. Andy, Culture Making was such a powerful book. Many of us read that book as well. What would you change today in this context?
Yeah, interesting. Well, one thing I'm really glad that one thing I'm glad I wouldn't have to change, let me put it that way, is that one of the real core ideas of my book, Culture Making, is that culture is surprisingly local. It starts with small groups of people in particular places, creating in a particular place. And we often think of culture as something very broad and if not global, at least at the level of society and nation. And it's certainly true that culture exists at those levels. But when culture changes, it always starts small and it always starts local. And that is really helpful right now, because a lot of the ways that some of us had to imagine that we were projecting influence on a bigger scale, I'm not sure whether we were or not ever, but we could at least feel like we were getting something done when you got on a plane and went somewhere else, or to some extent using media like we're doing now. Everyone's circles are getting smaller. Their geographic circle is getting smaller, and so is their relational circle, because there's only so much time you can spend on Zoom or whatever mode of communication you use. And the good news is that's all you need to make culture. So I'd probably double down on that. And the other thing, in a way, it's too late right now. But the other thing that I would have written much more about if I were writing it again, and wish that we had paid more attention to, at least in the United States in the last 10 plus years, is the role of institutions. Institutions being actually the way people arrange themselves for durable cultural impact and effect. And we have so neglected a lot of our cultural institutions over the last couple generations, really, in the United States in particular, in the West generally. This is not true all over the world. Other parts of the world have been in an institution building phase. I mean, at the extreme case, you have nations like Singapore that from scratch have built the institutions of a nation. And that's been in many ways effective, though there are still work to be done. But in the US, we kind of have been coasting on the institutions that we had. And these institutions are now in crisis. And it's very hard to repair them in the midst of the acute situation we're in right now. But I wish I had maybe focused a little more on that earlier.
Yeah. Hey, Andy, some of the books that you've written, Strong and Weak, Playing God. Katherine, you spent some time working, a number of years working in the corporate world. If you were sitting right now, in your opinion, what type of leaders do you think we need right now, whether it's in our churches or ministries or marketplace? What would you say? What kind of churches do we need or leaders do we need now?
You go, Andy.
So a couple things. They might even somehow magically all start with the same letter. Truthful. We need leaders who actually seek out the truth and then speak the truth. That is not the case for all of the leaders we have right now. And it's very damaging when leaders don't or won't or can't name the truth for the people they lead. A kind of related thing, but maybe slightly different, is transparent. No leader can be transparent about everything, but in a crisis, you really need leaders to share what they're thinking, or else people project onto them all kinds of fantasies and anxieties. So I think leaders who can be transparent without increasing anxiety, which is tricky because often the things that leaders know really will raise a sense of fear. And then that leads to maybe the deepest one, which is people who can build, have built and can build trust. The most important resource in any organization and any group of people is trust. And can you trust the people who are entrusted with leadership of your organization right now? If there's the slightest fissure or fracture, like even a hairline fracture in the ability of people to trust that person, it's going to be magnified. And we see this in these crises. People who were not acting in these three ways, it becomes apparent. In the last financial crisis, we had Bernie Madoff and the collapse of his pyramid. Right now with Luckin Coffee in Asia and China, we have a similar, the fractures get, opened up. But even when there's not actual fraud going on, is there real trustworthiness at the top, in a sense? That's a big question. And becoming the kind of, and this is not just, it's not just technical matter. It's like, who am I really as a person? Do I seek the truth? Do I only seek the truth? Am I honest? And can I be trusted? Those are not trivial questions for any of us.
Got it.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I led a company in Silicon Valley when the internet bubble burst. So while it was not as global an impact as this, it was certainly a collapse, and we knew that it was going to be a 4-year plus recovery of that industry before things really turned around. So I would certainly agree with all of Andy's words. I also think it's important to sort of decide if you're up for it as a leader. And it's okay to turn it over to someone who might be better suited to this kind of a time. And I say that out of watching a number of leaders right now, that it's just like they don't have either they're burnt out already, or they just don't have the heart for this level of digging in and re-envisioning and going down. And in some cases, I think it's okay to discern with God that God called them for that particular role, but maybe not for this role in this time. And how do you it's okay to walk away and put someone else into that role, or allow someone else to go into that role. It's also okay to stay and say, God put me here for a time such as this. So, but you've got to wrestle that with God, and you got to be all in. You can't do this just going to work every day saying, just, I hate this. I can't stand it. Why me? Self-pity. You can't lead with not being all in.
Katherine, any other coaching you would give to leaders today? San Francisco, LA, Chicago, New York, people that are in the midst of this. What else would you say to them? If you're going to lead well, here are some things you need to be doing.
Yeah, I want to jump on Andy's comment about institution building. That if you've been in a high growth mode, you've probably not really focused on building your organization or your institution as much. And just culturally, we haven't focused on the importance of an institution. So it's a great time to double down on strengthening the culture, strengthening your systems, strengthening your mission. And Andy's article, or the Praxis article last week, was about refocusing and just deciding what's the most essential things that you're doing, and where are the things that you can stop doing, which is always the hardest thing for a leader to figure out. But I put that all under the category of clean up and redo your institution. People in the media talk about, well, you're home now, clean out your closets, throw away all your junk, plant your garden, paint your rooms. And that's sort of at the institutional level also. It's a time to catch up, pair, refocus.
Andy, if I could, how about pastors during this time in churches? Things are crazy, right? It's a new normal. What would you say to pastors in leading through this pandemic?
The most important thing, I think, is to really fully let go of Sunday morning corporate worship as the main thing your church does, because you will probably not be doing it for way longer than you would like to think. And the opportunity in this moment is to rebuild the ministry you're doing from the ground up around small household-sized units of discipleship. And if you miss this opportunity, I'm not sure people are going to come back when you have the big room again. And if you take this opportunity, when people come back to the big room, which, believe me, I want that to happen tomorrow pandemic permitting, because we need corporate worship and we need the proclamation of the word and we need all those things that only really in that way happen there. So I'm not at all celebrating this, but if you work on these cells of 3, 12, 25, 50, which are really the largest groups in many parts of the world that are going to be able to be gathered for quite a while, you will so profoundly strengthen the ministry of your church that it will transform what those Sunday morning worship experiences are like, and your own experience of teaching and preaching. What I'm seeing right now, not to overgeneralize, and lots of different churches are doing it in different ways, I'm seeing a huge amount of energy in recreating some kind of Sunday worship experience. And of course, we need a weekly worship. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but that's kind of what church staff know how to do, is put on Sunday. And we're missing, like, the moment is to think much smaller than we usually do, to deal with, there's this interesting observation from a church architecture firm called the Aspen Group, that one of their principals said to me on Twitter the other day. He said the church has been really good at really large groups, like 100 plus, has been actually pretty good at very small groups under 10. We have had no effective way of doing 25 to 50. But actually really good things happen in 25 to 50. And interestingly, the one place in an awful lot of churches where you have a group about that size is actually the youth group. Youth groups often, for kind of demographic reasons and so forth, are that middle size. Mm-hmm. And it's really amazing what kinds of formation happen in the middle size. The trick is it's hard to do it economically, in terms of staffing. And so you've got to really rethink, like, who are the leaders? Where do the leaders come from? Are they all paid by the church? How deep is our volunteer bench? How many, like, Timothy-like type leaders do we have who can take what's been taught to them, teach it, and pass it on to others who can teach others? Like, we are missing that layer, and now is the time to develop that layer. Does that mean you're a pastor? So what do you think? Does that sound? Tell me if that sounds crazy, because I got to just sit here in my basement and tell pastors what to do.
No, I think that middle group is exactly right. The small group, cell congregation celebration is kind of what somebody thinking, and I think that congregational size is going to be very, very key. And that's probably what our government is going to allow us to experience in the next several whatever.
Relatively soon. That's right.
Yeah.
Hey, Andy, Katherine, let me ask you this. We're going to walk out of this COVID-19 with a whole different world. Zoom has allowed us to communicate with different people all over the world. Andy, you work with people at practice from all over the world. Katherine, you've gotten a chance with City in your work. How is this COVID-19, this situation, going to change the way we look at global ministry, specifically even marketplace or entrepreneurs? How is this going to change for our ability to work together, partner, collaborate, learn from one another, and in some sense expand global missions in a different way than we know it? Andy, love your thoughts. Katherine?
No, I want to hear Katherine's in particular, because this has been very much your kind of global focus, Katherine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of a local over global kind of person, in that I don't mind scale, but I want it to be scale with a lot of distributed autonomy and creativity and freedom. So I like the idea of catalyzing broadly, but implementing and creatively leading and collaborating locally. And so, in tying in with the last question, I think that's, I think churches should have been doing more of that all along. And if this puts a big nail in the stake of a mega church, it's fine with me. I think what, in our sort of franchise model of consumerism, et cetera, it actually suppresses individuality and creativity, and to use Abraham Kuyper's wonderful word, our multiformity of our creation. Yeah. And so I love the idea that that somehow we have to find a way to have a little bit more of that from a work, especially a corporate for-profit business kind of a work environment. I think just very practically, people will have gotten much better at doing things online. And so there'll be a whole rethink about what absolutely needs to be done in person and what doesn't. I hope that we don't move to an over focus on everyone working from home and the lack of team. And we were built with 5 senses. Our humanity and our creativity is going to be far richer if we are able to be in groups. But as Andy said, they do not need to be mass gatherings nearly to the level that we have experienced before. And I will say just a shout out to Praxis. They did a conference to 1,000 last Thursday, Friday.
Well, just 400 actually. Yeah.
400, but 400 people. I would have loved to be in person with all those people, but I had small groups and I got to know them and I'm following up with them. And so it's once you've had an experience that's been positive with that, you can start to think of new ways of doing things going forward. And both Andy and I could use less time on airplanes. And probably 2 of you as well.
I am trying so hard to be hopeful about the possibilities in this moment. I have to say, I really worry about a lot. I've worked remotely and with remote teams for many, many years, as probably a lot of people who will be listening to this and watching this have. But my rubric has always been that there are 3 things that are really hard to do virtually, and that's trust, creativity, and conflict. To be very honest, I don't know if I would have said yes to be with you all on a screen right now if Jackson and Tommy, you and I, each of us hadn't been together. I know the places where you've lived and worked and what you've built. We've been together. We've been together in not a lot of hours, but enough to really shape our relationship. And of course, I have the same kind of trust with Katherine. And then creativity happens because we're embodied creatures. It happens when bodies are together, when really heart, soul, mind, strength complexes come together. That's what it is to be a person. And it's just harder to do it through a screen. So I worry that we're going to miss out on a lot, even as clearly there are some kinds of collaboration that are going to become more available and possible. So it's a little soon to tell.
I'm going to add character development. So
yes.
I spend so much time with people talking about their workplace conflicts.
Yes.
That of course is always your boss's fault or your colleague's fault or your subordinate's fault until you start to really ask the question, what is God wanting me to learn through this conflict? And we're just not going to have as many conflicts if I can turn off my face here and turn off your face and, just do the task at hand. So I think our character building would be weakened if we had to stay like this.
Yes, I think that's right.
Got it. Hey, let me switch gears a little bit. Katherine, let me ask you this. And what both Andy has been ministry for a good portion of his life, same thing with Jackson as a pastor. But for you, you're a little bit different. You worked in the marketplace for many years. And how was the transition when you came from the marketplace to the ministry? And through your lessons, and I have Jackson here who represents the church and Andy who works a lot with Christian ministries. What would you say? What advice would you say to those guys to really be able to continue to minister to their marketplace leaders well?
Yeah, I mean, that's 2 different questions. The first one about what was the transition like, I would say the most 2 things. One is I think my marketplace experience did a really good job of speaking the truth, albeit maybe not always in love, but the truth. And my church experience maybe gave me a little love, but it was really hard to get the truth. And so I felt I felt in an uncertain territory for quite a while in the church world because I couldn't really tell what people thought or felt or were committed to because we just didn't say it as easily. So that was one. And the second was the lack of long-term planning. So especially I was in a startup world. We lived for the 1-year plan, the 3-year plan, the 5-year plan. And I was starting something brand new at the church. And you really can't do that with a 2% budget increase a year when you start with 0. And there just was not a process for thinking ahead. And I think that's typical in a lot of nonprofits and churches. So that was a big transition. Now, the second part of your question, Tom, would you repeat the second part? Sorry.
What advice would you give, whether it's Andy or
yeah,
Jen?
yeah. Thank you. My advice, number one, going back to an earlier comment, my advice is that leaders in the church need to not think that they are the church. They need to have a view of the church that includes all the rest of us, and that they are leaders in that and facilitators and equippers, but they are not the church. I think if we could get that across, that would be phenomenal for everyone. And so there's a respect that comes from that. There's the language of a pastor to a congregant of thank you for helping me start this ministry is just wrong. Thank you for joining in this effort for us to start this ministry is what we want to hear. And so I think that there's I don't know what the overarching word there is, but it's an inclusion, it's a partnership, it's a teamwork that is key. And the second most important is that their mission is out there in the world where they work, where they live, it's not just the activity that they join in that you start. And so I think church leaders need to learn how to lead when they're not controlling.
Yes, that's good.
I can't lead you and control you in your job in finance or on Broadway.
Yeah.
And I can equip you and I can lead and inspire and do the other areas. I can do all but control. And so I think church leaders need to get that understanding of leadership, that it is the work of their church when I'm out there in my job in the marketplace doing something well, and we can celebrate it, we can equip, we can even admonish if we're just not on track. But we need to just expand our horizon.
Got it. Actually, let me ask you a quick follow-up question, Katherine, but Andy and Jackson, I'm going to ask you to comment on it because both of you guys have done a very good job of empowering women in leadership. But Katherine, talk a little bit about your role as a woman. You were a woman CEO, startup, everything like that. Sometimes in the ministry world, it could be a little tough. Talk a little bit about your experience as a woman in ministry. And Andy and Jackson, I'd love for you to comment on it as well, too, after she's done.
Yeah, it's interesting to do this in a group with 3 other men on the call. So thank you for asking me the question. Yeah, I mean, I was in aerospace in the 70s and the internet world in the 90s. So I have been the only woman in every industry I've been part of for quite a bit of time. And so my comments are, I think the church was a little bit behind, so to speak, because it didn't have the programs of that corporate America had to go through of training people to be more sensitive to not just women, but any minority and their gifts and their needs. So I felt like I was going back a decade or two, but in general, it's blind spots on the part of those in power. And I think you talk about it a little bit in your Strong and Weak, Andy. Sometimes it's malintent. sometimes people, men in aerospace or men in ministry really have a view that you don't belong there. So sometimes it's a intentional behavior, but most of the time men are unaware of the things that they do that exclude or marginalize or minimize, and that takes intention to care about that enough to try to be more inclusive. And that's not just for women, that's across the board.
Yeah.
Got it. Andy Jackson, thoughts on it?
Well, maybe the single most helpful thing that comes to mind actually comes from my experience working alongside African American leaders, and there's differences and then there's parallels. But there was one just crucial insight from a Black leader I worked with. He said there's a big difference between white people, and in America, as you all know, this is so racialized that we often talk about white and Black, even though there's many more ethnic groups and much more complexity. But he said that there's a lot of white people who want to have Black friends and who have Black friends, but there's not as many white people who have learned from Black leaders, who have apprenticed under Black leaders. And there's a big difference between going back to women, I want to be an advocate for women, or I have even ministry partners who are women on the one hand. And I have been in situations where a woman led me with extraordinary competence and excellence in a way that I was transformed by it. And that is a real watershed. And now I respect the range of Christian convictions about what the roles are of men and women in ministry. Even Katherine's church and mine don't approach this exactly the same way. It's because scripture and tradition are complex on this. But I would say if you're a man and you've never been in a situation, ideally over time, where you were under the leadership of a woman who had an ability to do something with excellence that you also aspired to do, whether that's communication. And so whether or not you believe women have a specifically preaching role, they certainly have communication roles. What women have you apprenticed yourself to as a communicator if you're a man? If you're a musician, what women have you learned from as a musician on your instrument? And you can go through any domain, certainly management and leadership in the wider world. So unfortunately in the church, there are just a lot of men who have very rarely had that experience or haven't taken advantage of that experience.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to say.
Yeah, I think that the key thing is in the teachability. Am I willing to be teachable? In a phrase that we've used in our team, best idea wins. Whoever brings it, best idea wins. And am I willing to listen and respond? Because I need various voices. And I'm going to miss things if I don't include other people in the process. And especially you put a bunch of men in the room, there are certain things we will not see. We will just plain old miss. And so having other voices, having women speak into that enables us to have a fuller picture. But am I going to be teachable? Am I willing to submit myself and to listen and learn?
Got it. Thank you. Jackson, you want to take that next question?
Yes. I'm sorry. Now we're out of order here a bit. So let me, Andy, let me ask you, how can male leaders do a better job of providing a culture to affirm and empower women in ministry, in a ministry context?
I mean, there are very, there's a few very tactical things, though I do think the underlying thing is just, have you placed yourself in a position where you have learned through experience how much every human being, whatever their ethnic background, whatever their gender, whatever, how much they have to contribute, so that you just genuinely, you walk into a room and your initial thought is, here's capacity, rather than here are people I need to somehow direct. So that's like a fundamental shift from a sort of to pick up on a word Katherine used, controlling kind of metaphor for leadership, to empowerment and capacity unlocking. And a kind of baseline assumption that when people aren't speaking up in a meeting, it's because I'm missing an opportunity as a leader to create an environment in which they would speak up. And this can apply also intergenerationally. I work on a very intergenerational team, and we're always having to pay attention to both gender and age as to who gets airtime in a meeting. And leaders can totally reshape that. You know, you either go with the default, which is the oldest and the male and the most credentialed speak first and longest, or you jumble it. You like intentionally reset expectations, often explicitly, sometimes implicitly. Another super simple thing that I also feel like I've learned in multicultural work is how hard it is to be the only one. So we're not modeling this in a great way right now because Katherine's 1 against 3 here. Although Katherine probably could take all 3 of us. So, but how much is different when there's 2 folks who represent a certain experience in the room, whether that's 2 women, 2 people who are just out of college, 2 people who are from an ethnic minority in your context. There's a magic to 2 that isn't present when it's just 1. If only because when there's just 1, that person feels almost always a burden of representing the whole experience of this very diverse group of people who share that one characteristic, being female, being of African descent, being an ethnic minority in whatever cultural context. But when there's 2, you immediately see, oh, this particular characteristic doesn't come as a package deal with all these qualities. Like, these are 2 very different individuals. They have different gifts. They speak up at different times. They have different things to contribute. And it disrupts stereotyping, which is assuming that because I know one thing about you, I know everything else about you. So, you know, I would say actively setting the culture of participation along many dimensions, and then whenever possible, having not just one person who has to bear the burden of representing their gender, their culture, whatever. It just really changes the room in a good way.
Can I add one other thing I sort of long for? I think that if every male leader explicitly, not mentored, but something like that, we need, every minority needs a majority person, a person in power to have their back. So I think you see it happen amongst men. You know, I've got your back. I've got you covered. I'll tell you if somebody's against you. Yeah. I'll root for you when you said something stupid, and you know, say, hey, wait, let's give her another chance here. All those things. And if men could say, hey, it's my job for whatever minority it is to have their back, I think that would be really very transformative.
Katherine, if I shift gears a little bit, Katherine, when you moved from working as a CEO and moving into vocational ministry, quote unquote, at what point did you begin to recognize, hey, I need to go back and speak into and help those that are working in the marketplace, help them understand that what they're doing is important, significant, it's ministry, it's not 2 separate things, secular and sacred. How did that process come about, if I may ask?
Yeah, it's probably a longer story than we have time for, but I didn't become a Christian until I was 40. So I was already in a CEO role. And so I didn't really have a lot of the bad models. I was thinking, all right, you tell me that God's calling you to work everywhere. I guess he's calling me to this tech company CEO role, and I'm supposed to step into it. But that said, I didn't have any equipping beyond that for what it would look like to be in a secular leadership role. And I was in New York City, so I didn't have the sort of segments of the country where there are quite a few more Christian businessmen, business owners, leaders, things like that. So I didn't really feel like there was much to work with, except for the classic, but I thought shallow things like I have a Bible on my desk, or I'm home every night by 5 o'clock to have dinner with my family. I mean, it was like what I heard from people who were leaders was more superficial. And I was looking for, wait, and I've just like put off my old self, and I'm waiting for the Holy Spirit to build the new. And so we need to go much deeper in this. So, in God's mercy, I got a little bit over the next 10 years. But when Redeemer called and said, would you help us start this? It wasn't because I felt like I knew what to do. It was because I had felt the need so deeply for the prior 10 years that I thought, all right, well, I guess, God, you think I'm an entrepreneur, and we have a blank sheet of paper here. So let's create something that will really help people. So that was really the transition for me. Over time, in the role, listening to needs beyond my own, of people that weren't just in CEO roles, but people who are just starting out their career and everything in between, people of a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. Over time, I began to find the themes that really every good endeavor pulled together in one place, and the resources. I think my reaction once I started to dig deeper and grow in my understanding of theology was, how come pastors have been holding out on us with this theology? They tell us what to do. They don't tell us what they're basing it on, but they've learned it in seminary. I've now gone to seminary and I know they're learning it. So it the resources of our faith today, but historically over the last more than 500 years and going back to Augustine, it's just eye-opening and wonderful and amazing, and it changes lives. And I was just writing about how a book written by John Owen in the 15 somethings has changed, on mortification of sin, has changed people's lives in New York City that are working in the marketplace.
Wow.
And
Yes.
who knew? So there's a lot to work with.
Yeah. Andy, if I can ask you, I believe part of your story is the reverse, that you may have started in vocational ministry and then moved into the marketplace. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, in a sense, I have. I mean, I was in campus ministry for my first 10 years after university, and so very directly in ministry. And actually, I would say it unknowingly and unwittingly in a very sectarian kind of ministry that really did think that ministry was what mattered, and our job with college students was to get them out of their college calling and into our ministry calling. And we did a fair amount of damage with that perspective, I would say. All of my life, I've worked for Christian nonprofits. I think almost every check I've ever cashed has come from a Christian nonprofit, with the exception of a foundation that I worked for just 1 year. But I have shifted who I work with and the context I'm in. And I will say that the closer I get to the world of building businesses and ventures in every vertical, you could say, not just ministry, to be totally honest, the more fun it is, the more I learn about the gospel, the more I'm pushed to think theologically. I think it's kind of related to what Katherine said. You actually start trying to apply this theology that is sort of locked up in our churches and our ministries, and you start trying to ask, well, but how does that affect how you build a structured finance operation in a big bank, or how does that affect your real estate brokerage, or how does that affect the making of art, right? What kind of theater company would you build if the gospel were really true? It gets so much more interesting. and the theology does matter. In fact, I feel like my 2 years with Praxis, I've made more progress on, in a way, integrating my understanding of creation, fall, redemption, consummation in a deep way, in a fruitful way that I just keep seeing more abundance and possibility than I did when I was sort of writing about it from the perspective of ministry. So it just gets way more interesting and fun the closer I get to the people who are building in the world, for the world, but not of the world, really with their hearts and minds transformed by the knowledge of Christ.
Okay.
Hey, as we wrap up, because Andy has to speak to Jakarta in Singapore right after this in about 8 minutes. Let me wrap this up. I mean, Katherine, I'll start with you and then go to Andy and then Jackson. Is some of our leaders from Jakarta, Malaysia, Singapore, Austin, around the world, Los Angeles are listening to this. What is, Katherine, I'm going to start with you. What is a word of hope? What is a word of encouragement for some of these young global marketplace leaders who are listening into this podcast? What would you say to them?
I would say God's in charge, and most of our lives we don't really need to believe that. And so it's a spiritual moment that somehow God has in mind for every one of us, whatever age we are. But man, if you're in your 20s now and you can grow up and spend the rest of your life having wrestled with God now and saying, God, teach me what it means to be dependent on you and not on the ability of humanity separated from you to fix all the world's problems. Help me be grounded now so that you can use me to be much more tuned into your kingdom building the rest of my life than what the agenda of the world would have me on, of building my own career, me being the God of my life, but letting you be the God of my life. So that's even more important than the practical things, I think, is to dig into the Psalms, dig into, your time with God and who he is and what he has in mind. Because our circumstance, as bad as it could get, which could be really bad, isn't as bad as some people have been living all along. And God's still in charge then. Do we believe that or not? And then practically, I would encourage that. I've lost my job 4 or 5 times in my life, and sometimes I've been out of work for a while. And it's not a bad thing to reinvent yourself. It's not a bad thing to be loose with your so-called calling or your identity and say, all right, God, maybe you want me to shift or do something different or learn new skills, because really people who are my age look back and say, I would have never crafted this path for a career, but it's so much better than what I could have crafted. So dig in, learn, be open, be willing to let God guide you to places that you didn't know you would be going.
God, thanks, Katherine. Andy?
I would say you have everything you need. You have everything you need to bear the image of God in the world, to restore the image of God in the world, which is your calling, whatever you're doing today or tomorrow. You're an image bearer and you're an image restorer. And in the relationships you have, in your relationship with God, you can have everything else taken away and you still have everything you need to be part of God's mission. So that would be, that's what I need to hear every morning when I wake up, and in good times and bad times, but especially in times of trouble and crisis. You have everything you need.
Jackson, you want to say this last few words and then wrap us up in prayer?
I'd be happy to. I would say to folks, there's a work of grace that reminds you you're not as good as you think you are, but you're a whole lot better. There's a hope for you. There's a potential in you that you don't yet realize. Let me pray. Father God, thank you for the work of these two folks. Thank you for the way that you've directed their lives, the fruit in which they've borne, the influence in which they've had on many of us and will continue to have. We pray that we continue to direct their steps, and we thank you. Thank you for this time and the things in which we've learned and the way you have stretched us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Andy, I'll see you in a few minutes. Katherine, Jackson, thank you.
So great to be with you guys.
Bye, guys. Real pleasure.
Bye.